All right, this is Garland Nixon here with the great Joti Brar. We got lots to talk about. We got activist stuff going on in the UK, and we're going to talk about our bumbling, incompetent, hapless leaders. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here, fumbling around with my earpieces. I've got Joti Brar with me this morning, and I know a lot of people are looking forward to this great show and what we're going to talk about. And I am too, because I don't really know, but it's always going to be something good. Joti, let's start with this. I understand there's things going on regarding activists, regarding some of your comrades who've been hassled by the man. If you could update us on a couple of very important situations before we really delve into kind of what we're philosophically what we're going to talk about. We need some updates as to what's happening with those who are doing the good work of anti-imperialism.
Thanks, Garland. Yeah, good to be with you today. So the first update I want to give you is just about the first set of charges against my comrades, my party comrades. So, I told you guys before that we had two sets of arrests. Each time 4 comrades were taken into custody for 24 hours, held, their homes raided. The first time it was it was part of creating that narrative that says, if you're marching against the genocide, you're a hate marcher. Right? This is anti-Semitism. And so the charge against our comrades was for standing next to a stall that was selling our pamphlet on Zionism. And the charge was inciting racial hatred. It was under the Public Order Act. Now, they took it right down to the wire when they were supposed to report back to whether their bail conditions were being renewed or what was going to happen with the case, and then they just dropped it. So what we're saying now, I should do this, shouldn't I? Is that this pamphlet has now been officially endorsed by the police because they took us in for it. They said it's an incitement to racial hatred. They got their bit of press, 4 activists or 4 protesters have been arrested for incitement to racial hatred, right? So the narrative is built by these arrests because they're not going to announce that they've let us go, and they're certainly not going to announce what it was specifically that they were saying was racist, when this book actually is an anti-racist book, right? But anyway, it's interesting to see that they couldn't take the prosecution any further. They've dropped the case. The other case that's still pending against us, we're waiting to hear from what the police are going to do about that one. That was when our comrades were arrested under terrorism charges. Supporting a banned organization under the Terrorism Act is what they're accused of. And it's because our leaflet says victory to the Palestinian resistance. So that is support for Hamas. Hamas is a banned terror organization. Therefore, we were arrested under the Terrorism Act. I think the most likely thing is that we'll see the same thing. They'll take it down to the wire and then they'll quietly drop it. What's interesting is, while this is going on, and we're not the only people who've been arrested and then they quietly drop the charges a bit later on, consistently, over the life of the latest version of the Terrorism Act, people who've been arrested under the Terrorism Act. Now, remember, I don't know for sure this is what's going to happen, but it's likely. And what we notice is there's a pattern, which is there's lots of people arrested under the Terrorism Act, very few people charged, even fewer people convicted. So this, I think the government is, at this point in time, they're finding it frustrating. Like, they have this law that they want to use a certain way, but they don't really quite have the right policing and justice environment to use this law the way they want to use it. And I think they're starting to look for ways to change that overall environment, change the definitions of what extremism is accepted as generally in society, right? One of the ways they're doing that, I don't know if you're aware, in Britain we have this thing called the prevent system. It was all part of whipping up Islamophobia in Britain. And it says it's aimed at preventing the indoctrination of children with extreme ideologies. And specifically, it mentions Islamist extremism and far-right extremism. And teachers, nurses, doctors, they all get training in this stuff, right? Because they're supposed to report children to social services and to the prevent scheme if they think a child is being indoctrinated. Now, prevent is not a legal framework in terms of, you can't take someone to court because they're in prevent or they've been referred to prevent. But it's a kind of indicator of how society is sort of setting itself up in terms of what it sees as acceptable and not acceptable. They are currently redefining the definition of extremism under the prevent system to specifically include socialism and communism. Say that again. So now they'll be training teachers to refer children to prevent if they think they are at risk of being indoctrinated by socialists or communists.
Now, let me ask you this. I don't understand the foundations of the British system outside of the Magna Carta, but now, I'll put it like this, de jure as opposed to, de facto, in law as opposed to in fact. In law in the United States, it's perfectly legal. In fact, it's constitutionally protected to have whatever ideology. For instance, if you want to be a socialist or communist, this de jure in law, it's constitutionally protected. In fact, the U.S. has always gone after people who are communists and socialists, right? So that part of the law is violated. In fact, RFK Jr. recently said, well, sure, he understood the FBI tapping Martin Luther King's phone because some people in his inner circle were members of the Communist Party or had communist inclinations, or I'm paraphrasing, right? So he actually, as a member of the ruling class, came out and admitted, we don't give a crap about that, the foundations of law and all that kind of stuff. No, we got bigger fish to fry. Is there some foundational protections for having communist, socialist, whatever ideology you choose, that's being overridden in England, or is there nothing there?
You were talking to the wrong person, because I don't really understand British law myself. My parents are both lawyers, and you'd think I would know more than I do, but I don't. My understanding, and sorry to the people who know better and will come and jump on my head, my understanding about Britain is we have a system that's governed by precedent and case law. Okay. So we don't have a foundational document that says these are your rights. Okay, we have accrued a bunch of things, rights that have been established by precedent, by people arguing about them in courts, essentially. And there are things which are laid out that you are allowed, as well as what you're not allowed. I mean, I think the most sort of things which are your rights type of document actually comes to Britain via the EU, because the EU has a kind of declaration of human rights, which is supposed to be then put into the law of all the countries that have been in the EU. So that's a kind of positive way of expressing things, whereas I think the British system has tended to be more negative in terms of like, oh, you can't stop people doing this, you can't stop people doing that. But there is a tradition of believing that, particularly following after the English Revolution, and a couple of hundred years after that, there was very much a sense among British people that the state does not have the right to interfere in your personal life, your views, or your home. And the idea that the state can give itself those powers is always something that the English working classes, right from the 17th century, felt very strongly that they had rights as freeborn English men. You can't just walk into my house. You can't tell me what to think. You can't tell me what to say, and you can't come into my house. Right? They were the sort of foundational principles, if you like, of the English Revolution, and certainly the mindset of workers has been that's what they believe are their freedoms. But we don't have like a charter that says this is what you are allowed.
I tell you why. This is what I see, and to me, it's glaringly obvious. The so-called center has collapsed, right? It is completely collapsed in every way. So now what do they say? If you're on the far right, which they can define any way they want, okay, if the person's a libertarian, I'm not a libertarian, but you have a right to be a libertarian if that's what you choose. But so they define anything they don't like now as the far right. Well, that doesn't work well enough. So now they say socialism and communism is the far left. So you outlaw that. So what do? You say the far right is outlawed. The far left is outlawed. You reinterpret anything that's right wing, that's conservative, not just right wing, a conservative like Russian conservatism, like a basic religious conservatism, or etc., right? As far right. Anything that's anti-capitalist, maybe anti-globalist, you redefine that as far left. And so now you say our children can't be taught anything that's anti-capitalist, anti-globalist, whatever like that. They can't be taught anything that may be considered conservative, right? I've spent time in South America, a lot of those socialist countries, but they're Catholic. Some of them are opposed to abortion. Some of them could be considered, in America, they'd be considered religious conservatives because that's the nature of their history and their tribes and their indigenous people, etc., right? So you redefine everything outside of the, mainstream globalist failed system as far right or far left, and you make everything illegal except the basic foundation that's failed, that they want to push ahead. Does that kind of sound like the plan here?
I can really see what you're talking about, Garland. I've tended to look at it slightly differently over the course of my political life. You may well be right in the sense that, we're coming to the point where literally anything is threatening because the system is in so much of a crisis, right? But the way I always saw it before, they would use a tiny, they would use a target population, the fascists, right? Which is kind of almost universally acceptable to target. 99.5% of people don't actually, ordinary people do not sympathize with fascists. The thing is that silencing fascists was not that necessary during the time when they kept telling us they were protecting us from fascists. People used to say, oh, vote Labour to keep the fascists out. It's like, but the fascists are in the government. What are you talking about? And so telling us they're targeting the right wing, like extreme right, actual fascists in the West in the most recent period, not, before you get into Ukraine and all of that stuff, but, in the last sort of 30, 40 years, has tended to be just a way of making it acceptable for the state to give itself certain powers. And our understanding has always been that the ultimate targets of that is going to be us. We know that the real enemy of the imperialist system is not fascism. Fascism is the creation of the imperialist system. And in fact, they can silence a few, working class idiots who've been manipulated into thinking fascism is going to give them what they need. They can come down like them on a ton of bricks and nothing will change because they're not the ones who actually promote and create fascism. And the ideological kind of base of the fascist program, anti-immigration, for example, racial supremacy, those things you can hear from the mainstream media and mainstream politicians every day. So silencing and suppressing a few fringe nutters will not change the fact that the mass of the workers are getting indoctrinated with the ideology that underpins fascism all the time. On the other hand, when the state has given itself the power and people have accepted them giving the power, they've let this become a norm. Oh yes, well, we need to stop children being indoctrinated. Oh yes, well, we need to come down on these crazy groups. Then they just extend the list of who the crazy groups are, right? And you've kind of let the door open for that. Much harder once the door's open and you've ceded the principle. Then you're arguing about not whether the state should be acting in this way towards its people, but which are the right people and which are the wrong people. And then you're stuffed, basically. And that's, essentially where we are. The working class did not organize itself to say no to these laws. They went, oh no, well, of course we must stop extremism. And now, they're going to start adding socialism and communism to these lists. And it will be very interesting to see how the kind of mainstream center liberty loving people respond to that.
Well, and I guess I'm thinking like this too, and maybe let me know if this is kind of where you are. You start by saying, okay, they say, well, we're going to get rid of the fascist. We've got to outlaw the fascists, and we've got to outlaw the socialists and communists. That's what they say. But in the same way, they said, we've got to outlaw anti-Semitism. And people were like, well, that sounds fair enough. Anti-Semitism. Well, who wants that? It's terrible. And then they redefine it. When you say, I'm opposed to illegal occupation as defined by the UN, and I'm opposed to genocide as defined by international law, well, that's anti-Semitism. So the issue was never whether they were opposing anti-Semitism. It was that they would redefine the opposite of anti-Semitism as anti-Semitism. So my point is this: the issue is not whether they're outlawing fascism, socialism, communism, whatever, right? It's that they put those words there. We're outlawing this and this. Then if someone says, well, I have questions about anything, I have questions about a policy of, something that's maybe a little controversial. I don't know, puberty blockers for kids. Somebody says, I would like to discuss that. I have issues. And they say, well, that's fascism. Or that's communism. So they just take anything that they oppose. The issue is not even what we would even understand as the traditional definitions of socialism, communism, or fascism. It's now I take anyone who opposes anything that we want, in the same way that the opposite of anti-Semitism is now anti-Semitism. Those are the word fascism, socialism, communism are just little boxes for holding. So every time something comes out that I don't like, if it's a little more conservative, I'll say, well, that's fascism. If it's to the left and a little, progressive, I say that's, and those are just holding spots of definitions. So I can take out all the people that I oppose. Meanwhile, you get the suckers, you get the dupes who say, well, I don't like socialism. Let's go with that. We've got to stop them. Oh, I don't like fascism. Let's go with that. We got to stop that. Not realizing those are just holding spots. And as soon as you who supported it say, well, I have a question about this policy, you're going to get thrown in one of those boxes. What are your thoughts on that?
You've referred to or reminded me of something that's in a little book I just wrote. Literally, we launched it this weekend, so I'm going to promote it. It's called Identity Politics or Class Politics, right? And I tried to give an overview in there about, how we got to the point where, ladies who say that men or women don't have penises are told that they're doing hate speech, right? And, how have we got here? It didn't just pop out of nowhere. And one of the things I think that's really important to understand is when the working class allowed its struggle against racism and its struggle against the oppression of women, both of which are intrinsically tied to the question of capitalist imperialist production relations, when it allowed the ruling class to take over the mantle of protecting people against racism and people against, women against oppression, to say we're going to solve these problems inside capitalism using the law. And then we're going to educate people about their prejudice on your behalf. When they did that, they shot themselves in the foot entirely. Because, of course, not only have we not abolished racism by, passing laws, and not only have we not abolished sexism by passing laws, women's oppression, what we've done is arrogated to the state that benefits, that needs racism, that needs women's oppression, the right to police anti-racism, anti-sexism, defense of the little guy. And, then we end up in exactly the situation that you were describing, Garland, where they say, anti-Semitism, the state is going crazy about anti-Semitism, but their definition of anti-Semitism is like the opposite of actual anti-Semitism, right? The fact that our comrades are told it's hate speech to promote an anti-racist version of Israeli history and explain, where does Zionism come from? Why is it being used? And how Zionism is a racist ideology. the fact that the International Holocaust Remembrance Association created this new definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates, being Jewish with being Israeli, conflates Zionism with Judaism, and says anybody who criticizes Zionism is anti-Semitic, and that definition has been slowly and steadily being adopted across the Western world by governments, by councils, by companies. You can get sacked for criticizing Israel, in your company if they've adopted this definition of anti-Semitism. So this really shows the how it backfires when workers start to trust the state to solve their problems as workers. This is the state that belongs to your enemy class. It's not going to act in your interest. It's not going to resolve the problems that the system that it is maintaining has produced.
Wow. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And kind of we can use that to slide into our next the main foundation of this, and that is because, and I'll tell you why. Well, let me tell you why. Because what you're talking about is people, something I talk about all the time. The foundation. Do you trust the government to act in good faith in your best interest? I don't care if COVID's going on. I don't care if they're saying this country or that country is your enemy. Whatever message you're getting from the government for supposedly for the good of us all, there's a foundation. Do you trust that they're talking to you in good faith? And do you trust that they're acting in your best interest? The answer to me is no, because I, like you, understand that they act in the interest of the ruling elite against to keep us, to basically protect the ruling elite from us. And they tell us they're going to protect us from the ruling elite, right? They tell both sides, the poor people, we're going to protect you from the rich. They tell the rich, we're going to protect you from the poor, but they only really mean it to the rich, right? So how does it come about that the ruling elite who put up this state, to put up this puppeteer class, ends up with Rishi Sunak, with Olaf Scholz, with Joe Biden, people who are obviously incompetent, who have all been, look at the numbers, they've all been rejected by their own populations, and the only thing they can do is continue with a flood of media to say everything's fine, everything's going well, pay no attention to the prices, pay no attention to how bad things are going on, and that the fact that your so-called leader is an idiot. How do we get to that? What do you have to, anyway, let me just get your comments on that. The incompetent, hapless bunglers that end up in charge, and supposedly in charge of the capitalist countries.
Well, the first thing to understand is the people who are in the front, out in the front, like Joe Biden, Tony Blair, Rishi Sunak, Bill Clinton, whoever the face is, they're not the people in charge. They're the people fronting up, right? And it's not the same thing. So that's the first thing to understand. These people are paid servants of the ruling class. It's just a particular type of a job. Now, the second question to ask yourself is, in this world, at this moment in time, when the system is so decadent and obviously unable to deliver for the mass of the people, when whoever is fronting up for a system like that is going to be a figure of hate, is going to be despised, will have to lie 24/7 and be somebody who is basically happy to lie 24/7 in return for some good kickbacks, a nice pension, a leg up for their kids into the lower ranks of the elites. Would you want that job, Garland? No. Okay, so let's think about it. In the West, who are the kind of people who want that job? Are they the brightest? Are they the best? Are they the people with the most creativity? Are they the people with the most understanding? Are they the people with empathy, with sincerity? Are they the people, it's not even the best paid job, to be honest with you. Like if you're someone who has access to a job in the City of London, well, you could work yourself, really hard for 10, 20 years, get yourself a good, property portfolio and retire and, sort of never have to do all this, public. You have to be a bit of a narcissist, I think, to want that job where you get all the public attention. You're just fronting for a system and lying through your teeth about what it's all about, really. You know, your bosses are behind you telling you what you actually have to do. Your job is to sort of present it a certain way and, you know, look good in a suit and, you know, not be caught in bed with the wrong person for a few years, if you wouldn't mind. Honestly, I think the short answer is simply that once you understand that it's a job of a servant, and you have to have a particular mindset to do it, you understand why it doesn't attract the kind of people we would like to see in that job. And you know, this is not a new phenomenon. Karl Marx wrote, I think it was in the introduction to Capital. I wish I had it on the screen in front of me to read it to you because he says it really nicely, but I'll paraphrase it badly. And he basically said, you can tell, and this is in 1867, right? You can already tell that this is a system whose future is in the past because of how low level the people it considers to be great intellects are today. He was saying in 1867, this system is producing nothing that's useful or visionary when it comes to intellects. And he was talking about a guy called, oh God, I forgot his name. He was a famous, the bourgeois liberals love him. You know, he's a famous kind of philosopher and a politician and economist and all the rest of it. And John Stuart Mill, that's it.
Yeah.
And he said about John Stuart Mill, he said, on a level playing field, even molehills look like mountains. And you can basically tell how low the capitalist system has sunk that it thinks someone like this guy is a great intellect when he's basically a pygmy.
Yeah. You know, I tell you what it reminds me of when you said, why would they do it? There are people who want power and there are people who are happy with the illusion of having power. You know, I'll put it like this. Okay. You know, in America, when this whole rap thing was coming up, right? These rappers, and a lot of the time, you know, the 80s, the 90s, right? And a lot of time they came from very poor communities. What about, why did they wear the big gold chains, right? They put on these big gold chains, right? Well, here was my thought on this, right? They came from nothing and they didn't even have an expectation of being rich. So they were happy with the illusion of being rich, right? I don't feel like I'll be rich. I don't have a concept of being rich. I was brought up poor. I'm making a lot of money now so the first thing I want to do is present the illusion of rich. And how can I do that? With lots of gold, right? Which I used to, for a number of reasons, knew a bunch of organized crime guys. And I used to say the mafia guys were the only people that wear more gold than the rappers are the organized crime. A lot of them came from what? They came from the streets. They were thugs and hoodlums. They had nothing. And what do people with nothing want? They want the illusion of wealth. So they'll put something on that okay. You take some kind of a hapless bungler like Joe Biden, right? I know someone particularly who worked with him years ago, and they said he was not particularly smart. To be kind, to be generous, he was not particularly smart. And the guy had a thirst for power. So I think what they look for is someone who has a thirst for power and who is happy to have the illusion of power, to look like they have power. And really, they're just a conduit for power to pass through. And I think that's it. You know, they don't really care. They don't even really exist. Joe Biden isn't what he claims. None of these people are what they claim to be. And you watch them. You know, I watched Justin Trudeau, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, what I'm watching now isn't even Justin Trudeau. You know, it was like it was the most fake and phony Zelensky. Now they choose actors. It's Ronald Reagan. It's Zelensky. They're choosing actors now. So to me, they find people who want the illusion of power. But what you're saying is we have to understand that is an illusion. And the only way to address it is to deal with real power.
Totally. You know, the electoral system, and particularly since the vote was granted to the massive working people, and that was resisted in capitalist society for a long time. There were very high property qualifications in the early days of capitalism. In fact, for most of capitalism, there were high property qualifications to be able to vote. And that kept the riffraff out, right? And it was understood. Well, why would you let those idiots, you know, have a say in running things? The more that, I mean, and the politicians were always like they tended to be junior members of important ruling families, you know, so they were connected. And they understood the system, and they could be trusted to run it in the interests of, they were all connected, went to the same schools, went to the same clubs, that whole network, and they could be trusted to understand, the best interests of their faction of the ruling class, Whig, Tory, whatever. It's really under pressure of socialism, and then especially under the pressure of the Soviet Union, when the franchise got extended out to more and more people, they really had to make sure that the real decision-making was moved from Parliament to somewhere else. And I think you've seen that sort of gradual process whereby, Parliament became a really empty circus, something to point people at and make them believe in as the place where they should target their activity. The number of supposedly, anti-capitalist pro-worker organizations in Britain who focus their members' activity on writing to MPs, getting them to sign early day motions, pursuing, prettifying, underlining this illusion that we're sold, that Parliament is the place where all decisions about the country are made. And if you can change the minds of the people in Parliament, the law will change and the world will be different, right? And they keep us on this hamster wheel of activity, pointless activity, even though long ago ceased to be the case that parliamentary debate and really had any input into what decisions are really being taken, what's being implemented, what laws are being drafted, all the rest of it. It's not how it works. But there is a very heavily promoted illusion amongst the people that it is. What you can see in the modern time is just how little that resonates any longer with ordinary people. The more that their lives have been economically getting worse, that the welfare state, social provision, education, housing, even road mending, everything is going down, and libraries are closing down, community centres have all closed down, all that has been disappearing. People's lives have been getting poorer, more stressful, working hours longer, all of that's been happening. Through that time of the steady impoverishment of the mass of British workers, what you see, and I'm sure it's the same in America, although the details might be slightly different here and there, what you see is an increasing disconnect between the mass of poor workers and the electoral system. They no longer have faith in politicians. They no longer engage in the electoral process. Now, our rulers are quite happy for that to be the case, right? They will describe it as apathy and ignorance and say, oh, these people are just stupid and, it's their problem. Don't they know we fought for the right to vote and all this type of rubbish? And, try and act as if they're outraged and saddened to see how ordinary working people are just too ignorant to bother with the electoral process. But actually, they're very happy with it because, then they don't even have to worry about how those people are going to vote. But those people gave up voting because they voted for the Labour Party traditionally for decades in the belief that Labour's the party that represents their interests. And as their lives were getting worse, they discovered that no change in the government, no change in their MP, no change in their council would change their situation. They carried on getting worse. And they learned by their experience that Labour doesn't represent them. Labour and Tory are the same thing, that the whole things are rigged, that the politicians are out for themselves, and that the person that they, the class that they serve is not the ordinary people. They're not responsive to or interested in their constituents. And even if they are responsive to or interested in them, they can't do anything for them.
One of the things I wanted to connect to this is the current push anti-Russia thing, right? Emmanuel Macron, we've got to send troops to Ukraine, which doesn't make any sense. 76% of the French are against it. The French are like, hey, this whole situation with the farmers is screwed up and it costs too much to live, right? You say, if you listen to Rishi Sunak, the people in the UK, oh my God, things are difficult. What are we going to do? We can't make it. And Rishi Sunak says, we've got to deal with Vladimir Putin. The threat is real, and you go across, you come to the United States, homeless people wandering around like some kind of a zombie apocalypse all over the place. You're running for your life from crime. It's just an absolute disaster, a $34 trillion debt. I think every 90 days or 100 days, the debt literally increases by $1 trillion. How long can you keep doing that, right? and printing money. But so what we've got is a group of leaders who the people are unhappy with because they keep saying, what about me? What about my life, right? What about that? And the leaders are just saying, Russia, Russia, Russia. We got to go after Russia. They've just gone completely deranged on this Russia thing. If you could talk about your thoughts on that a little bit.
You know, I think what we're seeing in Western Europe right now is real panic at the impending defeat of NATO in Ukraine. It's really starting to come home to them that the US is looking for the exit. They're going to be left, if they're going to be left holding the baby. They've spent a shitload of money on it. They've destroyed their economies, and they're not going to know, number one, how to present that to their people, and number two, how to deal with all of that politically, economically, militarily. You know, the whole thing is totally terrifying, because the US leaving Ukraine, it's the beginning of the end for NATO, isn't it? And if NATO starts to disappear, the whole basis for the Europeans, the West Europeans, to maintain themselves as imperialist powers also is crumbling, right? Because they no longer have independent military means to back up their economic muscle in the world. Mm-hmm. And to be an imperialist, you need both. You need this huge store of finance capital with which you loot and suck the blood from the rest of the planet, right? But you have to be able to back up the power of your finance capital with the power of your military. You know, you come with your dollars in your hand and your gun behind your back, right? And right. That is the model. And part of that, you know, has been under threat for a long time because of the steady smashing of the technological dominance. We've talked about that before. You know, another important aspect of the imperialist system is technological dominance. And we're seeing left, right, and center how that is being eroded. And part of the reason that, you know, the US is and NATO and their proxy forces are being defeated in Ukraine is because they've lost their technological dominance. They couldn't just do what they did in Libya and send their bombers over, you know, and just do a blitzkrieg and say, you know, everybody get out. They'd love to do that if they could. They'd do it to Russia. They can't. They can't. And despite all the resources they threw at Ukraine, despite the kind of 2 decades they spent building up that army and digging defense lines into Ukraine and, you know, arming it to the teeth, the biggest NATO army in Europe has been smashed 3 times over the last 2 years, you know, and the whole world's been watching that. And more than that, the European economies have been smashed by the economic sanctions war that was supposed to be the deciding factor. It was supposed not to come to a 2 years grinding face-to-face artillery war against Russia. It was supposed to be get the war started, use that as an excuse to throw all of your economic might at Russia, and then Russia falls over. And Russia didn't fall over. And because the Europeans didn't have another plan, or the Americans, because they didn't have another plan, they just kept, you know, doubling down on that one. And even though it obviously wasn't working, and all that they have done, you know, is destroy what was left. You know, it was a process that was already underway, you know, the destruction of their home economies and home industries. But they have massively accelerated that process, made their social crisis deeper, faster. And as a result, the idea that now the USA is looking for the exit, and they're terrified to stand by and just let that happen, because where will they be left? So this is really, I think, where you see Macron and all his kind of shouting about how we'll just send 20,000 troops and we'll put them on the border over here and there'll be a backup force. But we need to we must act. We cannot let Russia win. They are feeling it as an existential threat to their power in the world, and I think probably rightly so.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think the issue is this. They're so deluded. And again, I have to say the they doesn't mean the politicians, the people that they work for, are so deluded that they can't grasp the reality that they're there's nothing they can do. You know, when people say, what's the plan? I always say, it's like jumping off a cliff. Two people jump off a cliff, and when they're in the air, they look at each other, and one of them say, hey, that wasn't a good move. What's the plan? Ain't no plan going to fix that. Gravity's going to handle that. You're going to figure out the plan when you slam into the rocks, you know, 500 feet below the cliff. And they decided that they were going to start a proxy war against the superpower on its border. That's never going to work out well for you. And now that it's working out the only way it could have possibly worked out. And here's the thing I think they have a problem with. And it's something that we get to when I talk about the brainwashed, right? All of the people that were running around with blue and yellow flags, believing these people, as people like us said, you're being had. Now they know at some point, the brainwashed people are going to say, you told us we had to suffer, that our economies had to crash, that we had to struggle, all these things we had to do so that Ukraine could get its great victory over the evil Russians. And number one, they ain't get no victory. And number two, there's nothing you can do about it. And number three, you told us that if that happened, Putin was going to attack us. It's happening, and he still ain't going to attack us. That the big problem they have is not the Russians. It's not even losing the war in Ukraine. It's they're afraid of facing their working class and being exposed for that the entire thing was a lie, which shows that everything they've said is a lie. Your thoughts?
I think that's definitely right, Garland. You know, I liked your analogy about the people who jumped off the cliff. You know, imperialism is a failing system. It looks really, really strong, but it is crashing on the rocks of its own contradictions, literally coming to pieces because of the internal contradictions of the system, which it cannot cure. Right? There is nothing imperialism can do to cure capitalism of the contradictions that are right at the heart of the system, the contradiction between production for profit and the impoverishment of the masses. That's like right at the heart of everything. And we are in the midst now of the biggest ever global crisis of capitalism, economic crisis. And because of the economic crisis and the difficulty of finding profitable avenues of investment, the drive to war is massively accelerated, and the drive to impoverish further the masses. So if you just stop and think about this, right? The crisis came about because the masses were impoverished and couldn't buy all the stuff that's made by imperialist corporations. But in order to try to survive the crisis, what do? They try to pass the burden on to the poor. They make them poorer. So in the process of trying to escape the crisis, they make it worse. And this is part of the tailspin that capitalism gets into in this kind of never-ending embedded, and because capitalism has gone global, we saw it at the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Only the Soviet Union was immune from what was happening because it was outside of the world capitalist system. But any part of the world, any country in the world which is connected to the global capitalist system is being affected by this huge crisis of overproduction and by the remedy that the Western countries, the imperialist countries who have imperialist global currencies, right, which means that they're imperialist countries, they can force their currency onto people around the world. They don't all use gold, which, is actually exchangeable. No, you have to use dollars, you have to use pounds, you have to use euros. They can export their inflation, the inflation that they've got from money printing. So they've been printing money to try to cover over the fact that they've got this huge crisis, to keep paying for things. But what does that mean? That means they've devalued, debased the currency, they've created huge inflation, and they've exported it all around the world. So again, you have this situation where in trying to solve their problems, they make them worse. It's exactly what we've seen with Ukraine. In trying to solve their problem, why are they so desperate to destroy Russia? Why? The reason is that in this situation where you're desperate for a way to make profits, anything that's not letting you make maximum profit is like an offense, an affront. Russia is a vast territory which is not under the control and the dominance of finance capital. And because of that, is an affront to the global imperialist system. They want to destroy Russia's sovereignty and independence so they can loot Russia. Because the way you get maximum profits is you get stuff without really paying for it. You know, you get the public to pay for the army and the weapons that opened you up for looting, and then you just take, and that's your profit, you know. And this is something else that the system is very good at. It's very good at passing its costs on to the ordinary person and keeping the profit for itself. You know, they tell us all the time that capitalism is trickle-down economics and that the people at the top are wealth creators and that we need them to give us jobs and employ us, where the truth is all the wealth in the system comes from the labor of working people. All of it. The direction of travel of wealth is from the bottom to the top. And not only are they rich from extracting wealth out of the work of working people, but having cornered all that wealth, they are then in control. They use their wealth to control governments, to control policy, to control how taxation is set and how it is spent. And if you look at how most of our tax dollars are spent, they're not spent on making life better for ordinary people who pay the bloody taxes. They're spent on oiling the wheels of finance capital. They're spent on subsidies to the arms monopolies, to the green monopolies, to the oil monopolies, to the the big pharmaceutical monopolies, right? They agribusiness. You know, look at what your government actually spends most of its money on. It's subsidizing the monopolies, right? So this is how the whole system has come under the control of this, you know, tiny group of financial oligarchs. But precisely because that's what's happened, it's totally unstable. Just that you've got this tiny minority of people desperately trying to cling on to power. Okay, they've got a huge machinery of power. Okay, they've got lots and lots of money to throw at people, to bribe them. They can bribe Joe Biden. They can bribe people to run NGOs, you know, and brainwash us and try to decapitate the natural leadership of the working class in various ways, to professionalize them, to buy them off in all kinds of ways. But still, fundamentally, the ruling class is a tiny handful of people, and they are impoverishing, genociding, you know, keeping down the huge masses of the people. And that is not a sustainable situation. And my fundamental, you know, belief is that sooner or later, the people are going to work out that there is no way out of this other than getting rid of capitalist production relations. You're muted.
Sorry about that. One of the, if you think about it, is there's a discussion of basically Europe saying we're broke, and the U.S. is kind of not really saying it, but they're broke. You know, they're broke. So they're saying we've thrown every dime we can at Ukraine. We don't have any more money, but we still want to do that. So they say, I know Russia's got $300 billion or something in and how can we get to Russia's money to finance Ukraine? Can we use the interest or whatever, right? In a way, think about this. What you're saying is the only entity that has been wise enough to make money, to save its funds, is Russia. We're broke. We've started this war against Russia, and we're like, we're going to take Russia out, right? Well, what's going on right now? Russia's economy is growing faster than ever. Their president has an 87% approval rating. He just won by 87%. That's pretty clear, right? So their economy's growing. Ours are all faltering. Their president has an 87% approval rating. Most of ours have like an 8.7% approval rating. Last but not least, we're broke. The only way that we can finance a war against Russia is to recognize that Russia is wise and they got lots of savings and steal their savings. It's like, well, who's got money? We're broke. Russia's got a lot of money. Oh, we'll use some of theirs. But in a way, that's admitting that a system that says we're going to continue to have an industry, We're going to continue to have some government-owned industries that we use to finance our military, to finance our government, so we don't tax our people together enough, right? They still have the legacy of the Soviet Union, which is industry, and which is government-owned industries that control the oil and the gas, etc. And that still leaves them with a chunk of money. And the only way we can fight them is steal the money that they're wise enough to have, because our system is completely crumbled. What a contradiction there.
There is a contradiction, isn't there? You know, you've brought up a really interesting, important point about what's a real economy. Because, of course, the basis for producing wealth, as I talked earlier, is work. So the basis of a real economy is industry. It's where people work and make things. That's where wealth actually comes from. What the imperialist system does is the owners of capital who built their fortunes, lots of them, through the industry of their working classes at home, having saturated the home market, have fortunes which are too big to be contained within their home market. And they start to go elsewhere to look for profitable ways to invest their capital. And this was the driver for imperialist colonization of the world, right? Historically. So ever since imperialism became, capitalism became a global system, the imperialist global system came into being at the turn of the 20th century. So kind of year 1900-ish, really the territorial division of the world into colonies had been completed. From that point onwards, you have a steady shift of industrial capacity out of the imperialist heartlands to where labor, land, and all of the wherewithal of making things is cheaper. Because why? Because if all your inputs are cheaper, your profit is bigger when you're selling your goods, right? So the drive is logical. As it all works out, as long as you are in control of those territories. The problem is that ever since 1917, the control of territories abroad has not been guaranteed. It's been increasingly under threat. National liberation movements, socialist revolutions have shaken and in some cases completely removed the control of the imperialists over these places, which, the way they see the world is it's theirs. And they just, I'm setting up my factory here because it's cheapest. I'm doing it here because it's cheapest. They do everything in the interest of what's most profitable, not what's useful to humanity or even sensible for their home country. If they stop and think about a situation where, like Britain found itself in World War II, we're a small island. What if we can't easily access all our colonies anymore? Mm-hmm. Oh, suddenly it's a very different situation, and we're all digging for victory. We've all got to turn our gardens into farms suddenly because we've been importing. I mean, I think before World War II, Britain had got to a point where it was importing about 70% of its food. And during World War II, it had to become self-sufficient. At the end of World War II, and this was before we started the kind of modern version of farming, which is basically under the pressure of US agricultural inputs, we have to do a certain type of industrial farming that, rapes the soil and ends up with stuff that's not very nutritious. Under the old method of mixed farming, they did a survey of Britain. I think the government carried it out in 1946 that said Britain is able to be self-sufficient in mixed farming up to a population of 100 million people. That's the population we still haven't reached, right? But whenever anybody protests about the way agribusiness behaves, we're told, no, but we need to feed the world. We need to feed ourselves. We're dependent on imports for food. You can't argue with agribusiness because don't you want to be fed? But the fact is that the capitalists do what they do because of the quest for profit, because that is the only motivator for any of their activity. And a comrade of mine likes to point out that in volume 2 of Capital, Marx made the point that it's only profit the capitalist is interested in. You can tell this because if he can find a way to make profit by cutting out the middleman of having to actually make something, happy days. He'll go for that. Right? So This shows you the absurdity of the system. You know, as an individual, all you're interested in is how to turn money into more money. You don't care how it happens. As a society, the only root of that wealth is in human labor. People making things is what adds to the wealth of the world. There's no other source of wealth. All the rest of it, if you made money and nobody who was involved in your transaction was making anything, somewhere, you know, you just stole some money off somebody else. Because somewhere or other, the root of that wealth was somebody working. When you look at what's happening now, you know, we've had 125 years now of this offshoring, you know, sending your capital elsewhere to engage in production and just bringing the profits home. And as I say, it all works as long as you're in control of everything, as long as you're in control of the transportation routes, as long as you're in control of the people and the territories where the activity is going on, right? The actual wealth producing activity. Now, you have turned your own economy into a parasitic economy. More and more of your own people don't produce wealth. They live off the wealth that's been produced elsewhere. If you can bribe them to accept that pointless existence, all right, for a while that might seem stable. But in reality, when push comes to shove, for national security purposes, you've shot yourself in the foot entirely. And this is something that all the anti-imperialist countries have to understand. Right? If you want to face up against imperialism, if you want to stop them controlling your territory, your people, your politics, your economics, your resources, you have to learn, number one, you have to mobilize your people. So you have to be running your country in a way that delivers something to the masses. Otherwise, why would they side with you against imperialism? What would be the point? Number two, to defend yourself against the anger of imperialism, which does not accept the right of peoples to be sovereign and independent. To become sovereign and independent, you are going to have to work hard to catch up technologically, right? So that you can defend yourself with force of arms. Because if you have no parity on the arms front, they will, you know, try to just crush you from the air. Number two, you're going to have to onshore. You're going to have to diversify your economy from however the imperialists have left it for you. You know, you see these problems, for example, in Venezuela. You know, Venezuela was used as an oil well by the USA for a long time. And in trying to become independent, they've had really big problems, not only because their whole economy was based around oil, but because even their refining capacity and the type of oil they produced was all pointed at the USA. Right? The assumption being that the USA is where it's going to be sold. So not only they've got problems that they're being sanctioned, but they've got the problems that it's not so easy to turn all of that equipment around and shape the oil for a world market and not just the US market. Right? So, and plus they need to eat. If your country might be rich in oil dollars, but if you're sanctioned in such a way that you can't spend those dollars, or you can't sell the oil and you can't spend the dollars to buy food, your people will starve. They can't drink oil, can they? So, you know, you need to build your agriculture. You need to build your own industry. You need to build your technological base. That's the reality of life in a world that's dominated by imperialism. And of course, what's been happening is, since 1917, since October smashed the monopoly of the imperialists on the global economy, that is precisely what people have been doing. And that is what's making the fatal weaknesses for the imperialist system today. They doing all their production elsewhere, and increasingly the chains of transportation and the places where they're doing their most important creation of energy and commodities are coming under the influence of forces that are not friendly to them. And suddenly they're finding that people are wanting to be really sovereign, and that totally explodes their whole system of how to produce things and how to make money.
It seems to me, you know, we've had this attack in Moscow. We've had during the Russian elections, right? There were all of these, you know, usual hapless, bungling attacks that were pretty much suicidal on Russia's border. And, you know, I have my suspicions about the recent attack in Moscow. I'll put it like this, for all of that stuff. it seems to me that the support that Vladimir Putin got from the Russian people during the election infuriated the ruling elite and the imperialists. I haven't seen, I mean, they were angry before. Then there was election and the people, 87% game, set, and match, right? And it seems that their rhetoric went through the roof after that. Like they screamed like, no, I can't believe, no, this didn't happen. Because now, again, I feel like this. The ruling elite are more worried about their people than anybody else. Their people are looking at that saying, you're telling me this guy's hated, he's a dictator, blah, 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 that the people don't support him, that they're in the streets protesting, and that they really want Alexei Navalny, right? But yet they're all voting for him and they're all supporting him. And it seems to me that this was a huge loss for them. And their rhetoric went through the roof. And some may even suspect that this attack could be related. Not saying that it is, that I know anything about it. But at any rate, your thoughts on how the ruling elite in the West, the imperialists, were infuriated and why they were so infuriated over the not just the success of Vladimir Putin, but I mean, we're talking, it's very hard to find a person in 70-some% of the people, eligible voters, voted, and 87% voted for the president. It seems like an overwhelming thumbs up for fighting imperialism. Like he's got the greenest of green lights, as they say, by his people.
I think you're right. The more the SMO has continued in Russia, the more confident the Russian people have become that they're on the right path, and they've been very lucky in the sense that this came at a time when the rest of the world was also ready to stand up alongside them. Russia hasn't been alone, actually. It worked very hard to explain to the world what was going on and help them to see, but they could see. And, Russia and China have increasingly been integrating economically and militarily through the last 2 years. And that is a huge source of strength to Russia. Between those two, they can open up their own new global markets with each other and to all other friendly countries, that are prepared to just do trade with one another on the basis of fraternal relationships, that it's what the Chinese call the win-win, right? Which just means respectful relationships as opposed to oppressor, oppressed, supremacist and the subject. When it comes to the desperation, the rage of the imperialists, you can feel their impotence, that terrorism is all they've got left. I have no doubt that the West are behind this horrible attack in Moscow, if not directly, if it turns out to have been a Russian group, I'm sure that they will be backed by someone in the West, and a big part of what they're wanting to do, well, they've got two aims now. One is they're still clinging on like crazy to the hope that they can stir up dissatisfaction inside Russia and get regime change. The bottom line for all the terrorist attacks is that, right? It's make life miserable for people to the point where they decide that this isn't worth the candle. I think it's going to have the exact opposite reaction, but I do believe that that's the logic for those type of attacks, the same way, we've seen in lots of other places. The other thing that they want to do, I think, and you see this in their response to the elections in Russia and all of the narrative around the elections, is to try to reassert and reinforce what is now a rather tired and crumbling narrative, the propaganda narrative about Putin, the evil dictator, oppressing the poor, Russian people who are desperate for us actually to come over and liberate them. And a nice illustration of this I can give you. I don't know if you're aware, but at the beginning of this month, Russia hosted an international youth festival. And some of our young people were there. There was a British delegation, and two of the people on that delegation were from our party. But you know, there were others there who were from other parties and people who were from no party. They were just there because it wasn't a political event. Actually, it was just a let's bring together young people from all over the world to interact with one another in an atmosphere of peace and friendship. Why not? Wouldn't that be nice? Right? They did a very good job of hosting it. They had people from all over the world there. Our young people really enjoyed being there. You know, for us, it's political to go to Russia at this time simply because Russia is facing down imperialism. And so them holding an event like that at its essence, it's an anti-imperialist event, right? Even if it has no sort of official politics, its essence is anti-imperialist. So we sent our guys there, although it was not a communist jamboree by any manner of means. And they found it very, you know, interesting and inspirational. And they loved to see, you know, how well Russia is doing. And they loved how many people from all over the world they met there. When they came back, the Daily, I'm going to get this wrong, I think it's the Daily Mail, did this massive hit piece on, and they'd gone to great lengths to try to work out which British people were there and try to dig up dirt on them. And they described them as Putin's useful idiots. And they described the event they had been to as similar to a Nuremberg rally, right? So this comes back to what you were saying earlier, where they get to tell us what fascism is and then protect us from it, you know, and you know, real fascism is a real threat to working people at this time. The reason being that it's one of the responses of imperialism in crisis. When the people start to become difficult to control, they get rid of the veneer of bourgeois democracy and you get the iron fist of fascism. So that's a real threat here at home in the heartlands of finance capital for us, for you, for me, for people in Germany. It's a real threat that our governments are going to resort to fascism increasingly. And we see the moves in that direction, like my country deciding that it's going to add socialism and communism to the list of extreme ideologies, right? That is the encroachment of fascism. But because we have a folk memory of being anti-fascist, because the working class traditionally was socialist and was against the fascists that had been mobilized by the ruling class, they manipulate this history and this sense that I'm supposed to be against the fascists and with the left. And they've just redefined, like you were saying earlier, they've redefined what left is and they've redefined what fascism is, turned them upside down, you know, and now Ukraine, the force of fascism at the disposal of Western monopoly capital, is the cause beloved of, you know, idiots who self-identify as left but are actually, you know, liberals who believe in capitalism and who buy into capitalist propaganda. And the people they're fighting, who are standing up for the whole world against imperialism, have been branded as fascists.
Yes, I certainly, you know, I think what we're saying ties together there. You know, let me ask you this. When you look at the what's going on in Africa right now, you know, the Niger recently said to the US, you got to get out. You got to get this base, you know, you got to get your base out of my country, right? You have when Burkina Faso, Niger, etc., when they kicked out the imperialists, such as they could, France said, look, we're going to attack and invade. And they all said, well, if you invade, you've got to fight all of us. Then Algeria said, you know, we'll probably be in it too. I think it was Algeria. And the Algerian defense chief was in Moscow that week. And it certainly seemed like there was a big fight gearing up and France backed down. I tend to think that some of Macron's anger is over and some of his fury is over the ejection of French imperialism in Africa, because looking at how France makes its money, I don't see how France can stay economically healthy. Not that it is in the first place, but I mean, without stealing everything from Africa, it looks to me like France has to, at some point, economically implode. Do you think that some of his anger towards Russia, Putin, etc., is founded in the ejection of French imperialism from Africa?
No doubt whatsoever, Garland. You know, we see this in Britain too, how the outrage of these old imperialists, who consider themselves better at imperialism, at more civilized, more rightfully superior, and cannot, but they already found it hard to be second fiddle to the USA, and increasingly they have nothing without the USA. Why is it that France is so desperate to create a bridgehead, a NATO bridgehead in Ukraine, quick now? Because it feels like it's its last chance, and it thinks that if it begins that process, it will force the US to come in behind it, and then the US won't be able to leave like it says it's going to leave, and it's obviously trying to leave. There's an impotence and a frustration there, isn't there? That the things that they want, the power they want to project, they can't do anymore unless the US does it for them and backs them up. They don't have that military ability by themselves to be what they think they should be. And they need the US to be there for them. And then so on the one hand, they try to cozy up and say, but our relationship with the USA is very special. And on the other hand, when they feel slighted and shunned by the USA, it's like a big, horrible insult. But the USA's ejection from West Africa is something I'm finding really fascinating to look at, because I did look at the beginning when French bases were being kicked out, French diplomats were being kicked out, and thought, the USA is very quiet right now, and they're sitting in the wings thinking, happy days. And that's not a new story either. I have a good comrade in Kenya, a comrade Bukuru Moli. He's the vice chair of the Communist Party of Kenya. Very interesting guy. You should look him up. He speaks very well. And he's very, very well informed and interesting. But on the history of Kenya, obviously, he knows lots. And on the way that imperialism has manipulated Kenya since Kenyan so-called flag and anthem independence has been very interesting, right? Because he said there was a period where they had a kind of single party set up, and they were still under British domination, essentially. There was a big democracy movement, a movement for democratization, which was sponsored by the USA. And in the process of the victory of the democratization movement, guess who got to replace Britain as the main imperialist looter of Kenya? It was the USA. Britain is still in there, but now they're second fiddle in their former colony to the USA in terms of their financial muscle. And interestingly, at the end of that democratization process, the one party that was still banned was the Communist Party.
Of course.
So they didn't become legal till quite a lot later. So that's a whole other story. But, so I was watching West Africa and thinking, how far are they going to go with this, right? Because I'm not in touch with, the movers and shakers in West Africa. I'm watching from afar with great interest, hope, I know that West Africa has a history, in the past of some great revolutionaries, of course, like Thomas Sankara and Amilcar Cabral and all kinds of people. But, in recent decades, I've not been aware of what's going on. And it seems like the movement we've seen more recently has got its feet in that history. You can see the symbology, the way they dress, the way they talk. They're conscious of that history. They definitely, in Burkina Faso, they talk about Thomas Sankara. I've heard that, and that's very positive, right? Because they've got a real anti-imperialist understanding, and I see them along similar lines to the kind of Hugo Chavez type rebellion. It might have come out of the army, but it's come out of the army in a very patriotic anti-imperialist current. Amongst junior officers who are sick of serving their exploiters and seeing their people suffer. And so the fact that these governments in West Africa have moved on from kicking out the French, the historical criminals in their region, and saying, we need you gone, to very quickly actually moving on to dealing with the US presence also, is hugely, hugely positive, a very inspiring thing to see. And you see the confidence that shows, the way they're getting together, creating this union between their states. That confidence is going to spread across the continent. And I'm sure it's putting the fear of God into every imperialist power. Britain, France, the USA, they all extract huge wealth from Africa still today, although they don't like to talk about it. And they have put so much effort over the last 100 years into keeping Africa down, despite all the national liberation movements. And I think they thought after the fall of the Soviet Union that it was going to all go back their way again. And it's wonderful to see that that tide is really, really turning. And I have no doubt at all that part of the existential angst of the French right now is wrapped up in that story too.
And lastly, I think that the Gaza situation is exacerbating the anti-imperialist sentiment in South in Africa, South America, et cetera. It is rapidly or significantly exacerbating it, because as the U.S. tries to hold on to, the pretense of the defender of human rights, scouring the earth looking for evildoers, the Africans, the Latin Americans, all of them are coming together saying, wait a minute, we see what you're doing in Gaza. The cat is out of the bag, as we say in the US. It's obvious. And it seems to me that they're pushing further away. They're looking at it saying, oh my God, we can see who you are. You're not going to do that to us. We know you'll do that to us. We're standing with the Palestinians. It seems to me that this whole Gaza thing is really putting the anti-imperialist sentiment in what we've called the global South, what I like to refer to now as the global majority, is really putting their move away from US imperialism into high gear.
Absolutely. You're seeing the global anti-imperialist camp come back together and solidify in all kinds of ways, in a way we haven't seen really since the death of Joseph Stalin. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. The way that it's not just China and Russia, but you've got the DPRK, you've got Venezuela, you've got Cuba, you've got Nicaragua, and then, all the BRICS countries, in different ways, becoming part of that increasingly assertive anti-imperialist world that says we don't have to take it. And the reason we don't have to take it is we have industry, we have resources, we have the ability to trade with one another, we have technology, we've mastered high technology, we have advanced weapon systems, and we have counters to everything you have economically and militarily between us. And so why should we lie down and take your rules-based order, which means do as I say and not as I do, in perpetuity? We're not going to. And particularly when, the imperialist whole global system is in crisis, and it puts the burden of the crisis onto the defenseless poor. So increasingly the poor are saying, we will not be defenseless. We will not take the burden of your crisis onto us, onto our poor anymore. And the more that happens, of course, the more it rebounds economically to the West. The more areas of the world that become shake free from the looting and control of the imperialist machinery, the more that the crisis will bite in the home countries. So we can expect life, I'm afraid, for ordinary people in the West to keep getting worse for some time. And our only answer is to organize and get rid of this whole system.
I think you're right. I think, well, and look, if you've got a system that lives off of feeding off of the the poor people, and they don't have any, the poor people are not going to be fed off of anymore. The system doesn't know what else to do. It starts to spiral down out of control. So at any rate, thank you very much. Certainly, sorry, I got distracted a couple times because I had a bunch of stuff going on for work, and every now and then I'd have to send a text. But thankfully, we have the brilliant mind of Joti Brar on to make up for the insipid and paltry intellect of Garland Nixon. Thank you, everybody, for hanging on. Joti, where can everybody find you online?
So I'm at thecommunists.org. You can see the URL
with an
there.
S. Communist with an S.
The Communists, yes. If you do it without the S, you'll get some CIA faker.
Always.
So thecommunists.org. You can also find our channel on Telegram, The Communists. I'm also on Telegram, Joti Brar. You can find me quite easily. I'm on Twitter, Joti2 Gaza, and our party is at CPGB-ML on Twitter. On YouTube, we are Proletarian TV. So do look out for us there. There's lots of good in-depth videos on all kinds of topics, including the most recent one that, might be about to go up, in fact. So keep an eye. Is my talk this weekend on this pamphlet. So
identity oh, I've got to get my hand. We've got to talk. I've got to get my hands on that. And everyone, I will be traveling from tomorrow, and I'll be back Saturday. So don't look for anything on my YouTube. Just share this with everybody. Tell everyone Garland's going to be gone. So we've got to watch this show 5 times. Watch it every day. Just pretend that it's a new segment and watch it every day. And remember, it's kind of like a book or a movie. You know, if you ever read a book or watch a movie the second time, every time you watch it or read it, you learn more. That's how it is when you watch Joti. Every time you watch her a second time, you're going to learn twice as much as you did before. You will have epiphanies on a daily basis. Just share this with everyone on all your social media platforms, and press the like button. Make sure you follow me on Rumble and Rockfin and YouTube and all of that good stuff. Share this. If you really want to infuriate the imperialists, share this, particularly on X, because they threw me off of X, which means they don't want this kind of stuff on X. Thank you very much. Joti and I are going to make a run for it.